Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Khaled El-Gindi, and I am a Senior Fellow and Director of the Program on Palestine and Palestinian Israeli Affairs here at the Middle East Institute. I'm pleased to welcome you to our first part in our two-part series, looking at the future of Palestinian politics, particularly in light of a new incoming U.S. administration. Just a little bit of context, as I think is fairly clear, Palestinian politics have been in a state of paralysis and decline for many years. The problems are well known, from political division, institutional decline, both in the Palestinian Authority and the Palestine Liberation Organization, chronic financial problems, growing authoritarianism and corruption, both in the authority in Ramallah as well as the Hamas authority in the Gaza Strip, all of which highlight a deeper crisis of legitimacy, as well as what many see as a lack of strategic vision on the part of the Palestinian leadership, whether in Ramallah or in Gaza. All of this is happening in an especially hostile local, regional, and international environment. Israeli occupation is more entrenched than ever. The settlement project has been a huge success and has only become more emboldened during the Trump years. Arab regimes have deprioritized, if not actually abandoned, the Palestinian issue, with many seeking separate normalization deals with Israel. The election of Joe Biden defeating incumbent President Donald Trump, while not a panacea for Palestinians, promises at least some relief from what many Palestinians saw as an unrelenting assault on their rights and political aspirations. In today's panel, we're going to be looking at the internal Palestinian political dynamics, things like how to revive and rehabilitate Palestinian political life and institutions, including issues such as reconciliation, elections, the question of succession, the future of the Palestinian Authority, PLO reforms, and so on. To help us better understand these issues, I'm very pleased to welcome today our really excellent panel of speakers. You have their longer bios available on our webpage, but I'll introduce them briefly here. First, we have Tarek Bakoni. Tarek is a senior analyst at the International Crisis Group and the author of a really excellent book called Hamas Contained: The Rise and Pacification of Palestinian Resistance, published by Stanford University Press in 2018. We also have with us Sam Bahour, joining us from Ramallah. Sam is a Palestinian American from Youngstown, Ohio, who was instrumental in the establishment of Paltel and the Arab Palestinian Shopping Center. He is currently an independent director at the Arab Islamic Bank and advisory board member of the Open Society Foundation's MENA office. We're also pleased to have Dr. Mustafa Barghouti. Dr. Mustafa is a Palestinian physician by training, as well as an activist and politician who serves as Secretary General of the Palestinian National Initiative, or Al-Mubadara. He has been a member of the Palestinian Legislative Council since 2006 and is also a member of the Palestinian Central Council. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Noura Arakat. Noura is a human rights attorney and assistant professor at Rutgers University in the Department of Africana Studies and the program in criminal justice. She served as a legal counsel to the U.S. House of Representatives and a legal advocate for Palestinian refugee rights at the United Nations, and is also the author of another really incredible book called Justice for Some. Before we begin, let me just express my personal condolences to you, Noura, and to your family over the loss of Sa'i Barakat, who I know many of us here know and have worked with. He was my boss for several years when I lived in Ramallah. So thank you for joining us, and please accept our my personal, and I know probably many of us here, our condolences. Saib's loss will be deeply felt, not just by his family, but by many of us. In terms of the format, I'll begin with a couple rounds of questions for the panelists, after which we'll take some audience questions. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so using the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. For those calling in by phone or watching the panel on live stream, you can ask questions by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please use that same email, events@mei.edu. Feel free to pose your questions at any time during the panel. We'll be checking in periodically, and we'll try to integrate them as much as possible into the discussion. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I want to start with you, Tariq, as someone who has looked at the issue of Palestinian reconciliation quite closely. We've seen many reconciliation deals over the years, most recently, the most recent one being in September, just a few weeks ago, following the Arab normalization deals. What can you tell us about the prospects for Palestinian reconciliation this time? Is this time going to be different, or where do things stand now?
Well, first of all, thank you, Khaled, for convening these two-part series at the Middle East Institute and for bringing us together to reflect on some of these issues here with my colleagues. I'm looking forward to the conversation that we're about to have. In terms of reconciliation, as you know, Hamas and Fatah delegations are today, as we speak here, convening in Cairo to talk about this reconciliation file and the ways in which they can begin implementing the September agreement. Back then, the parties agreed on the principle of elections and were theoretically awaiting for the president to issue a decree announcing the timeline of the elections, which all the factions agreed would be made contingent on Israel's approval for elections and voting to take place in East Jerusalem. As it stands today, and speaking to people who are involved in these discussions, the parties are still negotiating on whether or not the legislative and presidential elections would be simultaneous or sequential, and whether the elections are limited to the body of the PA or the body of the PLO as well. As you said, these are not new. The reconciliation talks have been taking place since Hamas was democratically elected in 2006. But the political environment we're living in today is different than the political environment, arguably, that we've seen for the past 10 years. We're living in the shadow of Trump's plan and of the normalization deals. As far as the factions are concerned, Hamas and Fatah, these factors, both the Trump administration's attack on the Palestinian liberation struggle and the normalization deals happening between Israel and the Gulf states, are increasing the cost of disunity. And they're calling for a single Palestinian front ahead of a new incoming Biden administration. If we recall, it was earlier this year that the Palestinians started talking about the need for, by the Palestinians, I mean, in this case, specifically the factions, started talking about the need for reconciliation ahead of the possible deadline for de jure annexation on July 2nd. So there has been, at least in the political consciousness, this sense that the urgency is now much, much greater. At the same time, there are factors that are reducing the impetus for unity, including the fact that as far as the PA is concerned, a new Biden administration might usher in a new phase of negotiations that could ultimately produce a Palestinian state, and therefore the PA might not want to complicate that by bringing Hamas into the system. There's also the sense that there's heightened polarization now in the region between authoritarian regimes and Islamist movements, And that polarization following the normalization deals is being reflected within the Palestinian national movement and might complicate some of the efforts towards reconciliation. But regardless of what this political climate looks like, I personally am still very weary of the idea that we should look at these reconciliation talks with any optimism. And I want to try to give three very broad reasons for why I'm pessimistic about reconciliation, and specifically reconciliation. I'm optimistic in the long run, but pessimistic about these reconciliation talks. The first is that these talks for me are a form of defensive reconciliation. What I mean by that is that the impetus for reconciliation is coming from the outside. What's happening is a reaction to external attacks against Palestinians. It's not an internal strategic choice that's driven by the admission that disunity harms the Palestinian cause. As someone told me in the West Bank, it's almost incredible that the Palestinian factions needed the prospective de jure annexation and normalization deals to put on the facade of reconciliation, as if there wasn't enough reason for reconciliation coming from within the Palestinian popular movement. So the driver is not an internal Palestinian decision to heal a rift. It's an outwards facing gesture that can dissipate as quickly as it began. And I think indeed that's where I think we are, in that an incoming Biden administration might take the wind out of the sails of the reconciliation talks. The second reason I'm weary that these discussions are consequential is that they're still largely based on the body of the PA and not on the body of the PLO. And I know that given the panel today, we are going to be talking about the roles of both of these institutions, but it's important to think about them in the context of reconciliation as well. That these unity discussions are happening in the body of the PA in the post-Oslo reality we're living in. It's arguably missing the point. Effective reconciliation, if the parties were truly interested in it, would focus on the question of the PLO and what it would mean for the two largest factions on the ground to come together with other constituencies and resuscitate a Palestinian national. That is what would drive unity if the factions were actually responding to popular demands rather than reacting to external threats. Instead, unity now is focused on ushering in a new government of national unity within the body of the PA, which would arguably offer much of the same. The final reason I'm pessimistic is really what I see as being a fundamental flaw that has plagued the reconciliation discussions since 2006 on. And it does not strike me today that either party, whether it's Hamas or Fatah, is interested in actual concessions that would be needed to achieve lasting unity. The PA in the West Bank remains committed to a liberation strategy that is focused on the principles of negotiations and international law. And as I said, an incoming Biden administration might reignite its misplaced faith in the US to deliver statehood. And Hamas remains committed to the notion of resistance, whether it's armed or otherwise, rather than negotiations as its way forward. Both of these parties see the other strategy as catastrophic for the Palestinian cause. So reconciliation today is simply a way of, the way I see it, it's a way of deferring the work that is needed for these parties to define together a single liberation strategy that might encompass the Palestinian people writ large in all of their various constituencies. Instead, the PA and Hamas are still committed to a zero-sum game of negotiations, which where each is working to ensure the survival and legitimacy of its own liberation strategy, obviously at the expense of the broader national agenda.
Thanks, Tara. Actually, your response raises many more questions that I'm hoping we're going to unpack in the course of this discussion. Sam, I want to turn to you. Tara talked about so much of the reconciliation hinges on if, when, and how to hold elections. So I wanted to ask you, especially since you're there on the ground, are elections really the key? I mean, so much of the talk right now seems to be focused on elections specifically for the PA. Are elections the answer, or might elections simply produce another contested outcome like what we saw in 2006, and we've just kind of reinforced that division rather than resolved it. And also talk to us about this relationship between the PA and the PLO. Who should we be having elections for? And in what sequence, and does it matter?
Thank you, Khaled, and thanks for hosting us today. I think first one has to put context to the entire discussion. We cannot have a conversation in 2020 about internal Palestinian politics without acknowledging the forced fragmentation over decades that the Israeli occupation has placed upon our people, both in terms of internal fragmentation, West Bank, Gaza, Jerusalem, sometimes even within the West Bank, and the overall Palestinian people being fragmented by having the majority of the Palestinians living outside of Israel-Palestine, not being able to incorporate themselves in the fabric of Palestinian political life here in Palestine. Within that context, we can discuss the internal politics, because our internal politics cannot be paralyzed because of that reality. We are a national liberation movement mobilized to end that reality. So we cannot wait for the reality to end by itself and then start to mobilize. I've actually written about a year ago an open letter to President Abbas, where I actually make the argument that elections itself are overrated. Elections are key, they're important in every society. It's the only proper way to have proper representation. But we don't live in a normal society. We live in a militarily occupied and fragmented society. So I believe that all the focus on elections is a little bit of missing the point of making sure it's part of a package deal. What is that package deal? My letter had 8 points. I'd like to just tag them very quickly to make the case of elections being part of a package. The first point is President Abbas must make very clear that he is not going to run for office. He has extended his office term without elections far too long, and he comes on the heels, and I respect his history, but he comes on the heels of 2 failed political strategies, one prior to Oslo and one throughout Oslo. It's time for that person to step aside and be respectful of his past, but not to hold the future of the Palestinian political process hostage. That would mean that he would immediately, especially given his age, would appoint deputies, find a way within the political system, and he's issuing decrees, presidential decrees left and right. One of them could be, even if it's not within our basic law, it doesn't prohibit him appointing deputies for the 3 positions which he holds, and all of them are key, which is President of Palestine, Chairman of the PLO, and President of the Palestinian National Authority. Those cannot be embodied in one person. The second step out of the 8 I would recommend is that he go to Gaza and engage not only Hamas, because Gaza is a more dynamic environment than just having a single party, even though that party is in control, and to engage all the political entities on the ground in Gaza and go every week. It should not be international news that Abbas is going to go to Gaza. It should be part and parcel of his mandate, especially as we are in a divided society today, in order to help mend that political system together. Thirdly, and maybe this is the most important one, and before elections, the 2 ruling parties need to agree, and I would start with the PLO, but also within the Palestinian Authority, to enact a political party law. It makes no sense to me whatsoever that when we speak of PLO factions, we are basically talking about a dozen or so factions that were created in the 1960s. Other than the Mubadara, and they're struggling to be a chair at this, a full seat at the table. Other than that, we have had no new political assembly in the Palestinian society, even though we know that we have political thought across the Palestinian territory and in the diaspora communities and in the refugee communities. Those communities and political thought must be able to assemble formally within parameters that the PLO sets for itself, but there needs to be an open door to legitimize new national assemblies that can come forward with new political thought. We cannot be held hostage to one political party in West Bank and one political party in Gaza, or what's being talked about now is the best case scenario, a duopoly, which is agreeing to making sure that the system remains closed. So political party law, enacting it and getting more people involved in the political process to me is key. Fourth, I would suggest that an item that came out of the Oslo Accords, because the Oslo Accords has a bad rap, rightfully so, but there are some elements that came out of the Oslo Accords that are positive to our national movement. One of them is an institution called the Central Elections Commission. It has its act together, it knows what it's doing, it's been holding local elections for the last 2 decades. That entity has a mandate dictated to it by the parameters of the Oslo period to only register Palestinians under military occupation. If we have really absolved ourselves, as President Abbas announced recently, of all the agreements with Israel, Oslo Accords being one of them, nothing should stop the Palestinian leadership from remandating the Central Elections Commission to start registering Palestinians wherever they are, anywhere in the world. So we actually have a population registry of our people in preparation for elections at the PLO level, which is the umbrella organization for all Palestinians. Fifth, we should have elections. Where we can have free and fair elections, we should have them. And there's many places we could have them, including some of the cities in the West Bank are open to have free elections. Where we cannot have elections, and Tarek mentioned something very important, that the factions today are kind of agreeing that they will have to get Israeli approval for Jerusalem to be able to have elections before they accept elections. That's disastrous in my opinion. As a national liberation movement, we had representation, and that's what I'm looking for, an upgrade in representation, not pure elections. We had representation when the movement prior to Oslo was underground in Lebanon. We had representation. We know how to work in a crisis environment. Now that we are in Palestine as the focal point, we shouldn't lose the experience that we have in having better representation, even if that means some places aren't going to have full and fair elections. And here I think civil society can play a role. And number 6 would be, once we do have elections, the first item on the agenda should be to look at the mandate of the Palestinian Authority, the entity, the administrative entity that's responsible for the people, the Palestinians under military occupation, and retool it, remandate it. Don't throw it away. If people are calling for the Palestinian Authority to be dismantled and thrown away, I have to ask a very simple question. My 2 daughters, who actually graduated from the Palestinian education system, would have had an advantage to today's parents' 2 daughters. Because if there is no Palestinian Authority, there is no Ministry of Education. There's an Israeli general that will run our education system and our healthcare system, et cetera, et cetera. That is not in our interest. What is in our interest is to remandate, retool, and restructure the Palestinian Authority, not to serve the Oslo process or the security cooperation only with Israel, but to be able to serve the community. And the last 2 items would be, with a new representative leadership, we have to start to lead our solidarity movement. Our solidarity movement around the world is something that will be written about forever. It is strong, it is deep, and it is across the globe, but it is unled by the national movement itself. And secondly, we need to engage the United States. We cannot be looking at the United States through a single window called the White House. And when the White House is closed to us, like it was under the last 4 years of Trump, we pretend like the US should not be looked at. The US, as we all know, is a very complicated political animal, and we need to start to take the US seriously and start working at all levels of government and start speaking political language in the US. I don't see that happening today. So I would stop there. Those are 8 points putting elections in a package?
Thank you, Sam. Obviously, you've all thrown out, there's quite a bit on the table here to try and digest. Noura, you're welcome to respond to anything that we've seen, but I want to hone in more specifically on this question of what is the proper political address for the Palestinian people. Tarek told us about how the PA has become now kind of the epicenter of Palestinian politics, largely at the expense of the PLO, which is historically the umbrella that represents all Palestinians, whether inside or outside of historic Palestine. Is the PLO even still relevant? And what should the relationship between the PLO and the PA actually be? Because today it seems sort of like a tail wagging the dog, where the PLO has kind of become an appendage of the Palestinian Authority, even though it is the PA is an institution created by the PLO in essence.
Absolutely. Thank you, Khaled. Hello to the panelists. It's an honor to be with you, and also to the audience. I want to start with just two caveats. One is to echo my condolences to everybody for the loss of Dr. Saeb Ariqat. He was first and foremost my uncle and remains so. I'm actually honoring him today with this necklace, which he gave to me upon my law school graduation. So just to hold space for him. Also, I want to say just really quickly, this is not part of the scope of my question, but it also in part addresses Sam's last point about how do we pivot? How does the Palestinian officialdom, how does it pivot towards the United States in the aftermath of the Trump administration? In the course of our brief, talk right now, I have an op-ed that just went live on the Washington Post, which tries to answer that question. And in some, I highlight that there really isn't that much difference between Trump necessarily, the Republicans and Democrats. Certainly there would be difference with anybody with Trump because he was so brazen, even with another Republican administration. But that Biden continues to represent the mainstream electoral base, which is actually being fractured right now by a progressive insurgency within. And so I offer that the Biden administration is not going to offer necessarily any solutions or any difference. He insists that at the very basis, will not return the embassy from Jerusalem back to Tel Aviv in line with the 2020 Democratic National Committee platform. And nonetheless, the Biden administration offers opportunities for strategic intervention, twofold. One is time. The time that we were not given by the cascading blows that the Trump administration represented. We say 4 years, but in fact, in the last 2 years alone. And the second is being able to, take advantage and leverage this wedge within the Democratic Party itself. And I'll post that here in the chat for folks who want to see it, but just in response to what does it mean to pivot, right? Because in the past, when we did pivot to the United States, it was pandering. And that's what we need not do. The United States is not going to deliver a Palestinian state. And yet this Palestinian official leadership has been banking on that and pursuing that strategy of acquiescence since 1993, and even more so since 2001 upon the collapse of the Camp David peace talks. And so it's important for us not to see in the United States necessarily an ally, but instead as a point of strategic intervention that cannot be missed. On to the question about the PLO. What is the political address for the Palestinians today? So I think that means, we tend to think of the PLO as just the representative body, but at the time that it was established in 1964, and more significantly in 1968, when it was taken over by the Palestinian militant factions that, came up organically, right? And Yasser Arafat assumed its helm. The PLO began a strategy of asserting and affirming that Palestinians are a juridical people, or a people within the meaning of international law, which affords them as a people the right to self-determination and distinguishes them from the humanitarian crisis, the way that Palestinians had been framed between 48 and 68, which is they're a humanitarian crisis. It's a refugee issue. They need to be sheltered. They need to be educated and some, formula for return, but not a political condition whose self-determination was usurpated. And in that moment of affirming that juridical peoplehood, there was contest from other Arab states and Arab regimes that insisted that they were the proper leader of, the Palestinian territories, including Jordan, who considered it the West Bank to their East Bank and the Jordan River. So in the moment that the PLO emerges, it's emerging not only to provide an umbrella, or as it's crystallizing as a political body in 68, not necessarily just to provide an electoral, an accountable umbrella. It's telling the world, we are not just, a group of refugees that need homes. We are a political crisis in need of a political solution that should represent themselves. And they affirm that by 1974 in UN General Assembly Resolution 3236, when the PLO was recognized as the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Henceforth, Palestinians must be dealt with as a national struggle with the right to the right to use arms and the right to engage in these diplomatic fora to achieve that end, right? By 1988, the PLO and its body, the PNC, now articulate a truncated vision for what Palestinian liberation does, and now we have what is also where the two-state solution. The writing was on the wall by 1993 that this solution was inequitable and unfair. The writing was on the wall and the bifurcation between the negotiations in Washington and Madrid, where there was intransigence and resistance to the terms that Washington and Israel were offering, in contrast to what was happening in the back deal, closed secret negotiations, which were frankly, in many ways, betrayal of a more public movement, which was a series of concessions in order to garner, in Abu Ala's words, the recognition, Israel's recognition of the PLO as a people, which was considered, for all indigenous peoples who are struggling for recognition. And this is the epitome that no longer to just be considered criminal terrorists, but to be considered a people within the meaning of international law with the right to self-determination, but knowingly entered into that agreement, the Declaration of Principles, knowingly that it was not delivering a state, that there was no promise of a state, that it was inequitable, but did it on faith, in the language of the PLO itself, did it on faith in order to achieve an outcome. And though there was no insurgency within the PNC, only about 25 members didn't vote on this at the next PNC meeting in order to approve the agreement. Even though several negotiators actually did resign, notably Haidar Abdel-Shafi amongst them, most negotiators stayed on board because they believed that this was worth it. And in the words of Camille Mansour, a Palestinian legal jurist, in his words, this was about saving the Palestinian national struggle. The PLO was a national home. If we lost the PLO, we would lose the struggle. And so this is where we remain. We haven't reevaluated this and instead are thinking about it as an electoral body, except one, it was saved at a very high cost. We saved the PLO at the cost of a national struggle. Essentially, now we have the benefit of retrospect. And so we have to reevaluate whether or not that trade-off is worth it and whether or not there would be other opportunities to build in its place. Secondly, it's important to recognize that the PLO is supposed to be a sum of its parts. And as Sam has pointed out, its parts are also hollow. It's not as if, right, we just need the representative body, but we also need the political parties, and the political parties themselves are stale and a bit antiquated and out of touch with the Palestinian street, right? So what is it that we're trying to resurrect if it's the sum of its parts and its parts are not necessarily robust and vibrant? Thirdly, I think that you're right, Sam, that we do need administrative bodies, but the Palestinian Authority can exist outside of the realm of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The Palestinian Authority was supposed to be the administrative body responsible for municipal services and things like, mail and sewage and education and other things that we could otherwise provide for ourselves, but should not be conflated with the international arm of the Palestinian liberation movement, and should not be conflated with the diplomatic strategy, and should not be conflated with the liberation strategy, and should not be conflated with, some body, some institutional body that's able to represent Palestinians in the diaspora. And so there's room for change. And unfortunately, I don't think that that's an easy policy answer, but it does require some imagination and understanding that we should believe that looking to organic leadership could constitute something new that we're not aware of. The fact that the Palestinian international struggle remains alive in international bodies, despite what I would think would be a not very effective official body to represent Palestinians internationally, tells us a lot about the capacity of what Palestinians can do and have been doing and continue to do, were resources to be diverted, and if we had a shift in the way that we thought about our potential forward.
Thank you, Noura. Dr. Mustafa, I wanted to turn to you as someone who's been an active participant in Palestinian politics, as a presidential candidate and a PLC member, and a founder of one of these new political parties, the Palestinian Initiative. How do you see what is needed to rehabilitate and revive Palestinian political life? And again, if you could maybe drill down a little bit on the role of the PLO and the question of reconciliation. How can we have a reformed PLO as well as a unified Palestinian polity that includes all of its constituent parts?
Thank you. Well, I'm glad to be with the panel, and I greet every one of them. But I have news for you. If you think our situation was complicated, it's now more complicated because the PA has just announced that it is renewing its relations with Israel, doing the coordination with Israel. And already this is creating very serious negative responses from many Palestinian political parties. It's so unfortunate that if these news are correct, that they are rushing into that direction. But it was always obvious to us and to me that there was a delay in the process of unification or ending the internal division. As the closer we got to American elections, the slower the movement was. Then it stood still. And obviously, there is a certain line that was waiting for Biden to be elected. And my biggest worry today is that we will move back from the situation of the proper possibility of immediate annexation under Trump to incremental annexation with settlement activities under Biden. It's very clear that some people are thinking of going back to the useless negotiations with Israel, the same path that lasted more than 27 years and led to nothing but weakening the Palestinian side. It's the path of engaging in a peace process that becomes an alternative to peace, and in a process of negotiations that become the alternative to a solution. This is what is waiting us now. And I'm so discouraged by this new news about renewing relations with Israel without any particular reason. I mean, nothing changed. Israel has just announced more annexation and just more settlements, and just announced that it's going to proceed with violating the law. So there is no justification for this. But this will complicate further, of course, the possibility of reunifying Palestinians. I want to say something, and maybe this is also in the line of what Noura said. I do not think that Trump's plan will disappear with Trump. What we have to understand is that the deal of the century is actually an Israeli deal. It is an Israeli plan. It was written by Netanyahu. It was enveloped by Trump, but in reality, it is an Israeli plan, and the Israelis will continue to try to pass it and will continue in different ways, also through the new American administration. So
I think we lost you, Dr. Mustafa. Maybe it looks like your connection is frozen. Could you repeat that last part, because we lost you for a moment?
okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I say that the main problem today is the fact that there is a very serious imbalance of power between us and Israel. And unless we have a strategy that deals with that, nothing will change. Without changing the balance of power, without adopting a new alternative strategy to what has failed, and specifically Oslo process and Oslo agreement, and reliance on the United States to be the mediator in the process, without changing that line completely, nothing will change. And that's why we've been calling for an alternative strategy. And that's the way we should go. And that includes external and internal elements. But in response to your question, you asked what are the problems with the political system or the political regime, if you want. I think there are several ones and several problems. Maybe I can name 8 of them at least. But I will start by saying that the first big problem in the political Palestinian system is the dissolution of the PLO and the PA, and the Palestinian Authority. I think it was said already, but the PLO has become only a budget line in the Palestinian Authority budget. And that is very problematic, because that includes not only the Fatah, which is controlling the PLO, but also the other parties that are dependent on the support that they get from the Palestinian, from the PLO and from the Palestinian Authority, as a matter of fact. It has, by the way, it has just been announced again that security coordination with Israel has just been renewed. I'm so sorry for that. The second problem is the fact that we have an internal division. And that internal division, which started as a dispute over the program, over the strategy, over the ideas, if you want, evolved gradually to become a division between 2 authorities. 2 authorities, both of which are under occupation in different ways, of course. In West Bank under full military occupation, in Gaza under a different form, but it is which reflects itself as a siege on Gaza, the Israeli control of airspace, of water, of sea, of borders, of everything. So 2 authorities controlling people's lives, Palestinian lives, within ghettos, within pantostans, within 224 small ghettos, if you want, or small enclaves, with 1 big enclave in Gaza. But these authorities control the lives of people in these enclaves, but they are, and the people, under the Israeli occupation. The third problem is within the structure that was created, which is the Palestinian Authority and the PLO, we don't have the principle of separation of powers. There is no independent judiciary power. There is no independent legislative power, especially after the dissolution of the Palestinian Legislative Council. So you have 2 executive authorities, both of which control the judiciary system, control the executive power, and control legislation. And that has consolidated, instead of 1-party rule, 2 1-party rules. This is the biggest problem in the political system that we face today. And of course, to consolidate that system, what is used as an instrument of political organization instead of the normal forms of political organizations where you have membership and members have a say in what happens. The system is based on nepotism and clientelism. I don't think I am bringing news here, but I think it's very clear to everybody. Nepotism and clientelism. And when you are dependent on funding from abroad, on funding from other countries, your ability to conduct an independent line to sustain your popular support, you have to be dependent on the financial aid from abroad. Or, of course, in the case of the Palestinian Authority, on the tax revenues that you control from people. The other problem is that, which most Palestinians see as a major problem within the political structure, is the system of what we call wasta and mahsubiyya, which is nepotism again. This is the main problem if you speak about issues like corruption. And I think there has been another decline, which we have witnessed frequently in the most recent municipality elections, actually in the last two municipality elections, which is a decline to tribalism, a decline to family control, a decline of the political structure. The modern political system is leaving the place for more tribal involvement and more tribal control. But the biggest problem, of course, within the system is the absence of the rule of law. There is no rule of law, whether we speak about the PLO or we speak about the Palestinian Authority. And then we come to the largest probably problem within the Palestinian people, which is the fact that since Oslo Agreement was signed, we've witnessed separation between Palestinians in the diaspora, Palestinians who live abroad, Palestinian refugees, and Palestinians living in the occupied territories, and those who live in the 1948 areas. So practically, this cohesion of all these parts of the Palestinian people was lost since Oslo Agreement. And we cannot build a new strategy without re-establishing that kind of connection between these three parts as a major part of that strategy. So how can we move forward? Of course, we need unity, but we also need democracy. And more important, we need an alternative strategy to what has failed. I do believe that this absence of a unified strategy is the main problem that is preventing the possibility of unity. And the other thing is the absence of a democratic system, a democratic process. We should have unity. And that's why we've been calling for a unified national Palestinian leadership. What we need is, we have to accept the fact that there is pluralism within the Palestinian people. There are different political forces. No one party can control the political system alone. It's impossible. The only way to create a front, a national front, is to accept two principles: the principle of pluralism and tolerance to that, and the other principle is democracy and democratic participation of the people. So that's where we stand. These are the elements that could provide the possibility of unity, but at the same time guarantee that there will be elections. And I don't mean by elections only in the West Bank or Gaza, but elections that include Palestinians everywhere, a representative system which brings back life to the PLO. If it wants to represent the Palestinian people, it has to give the Palestinians the right to choose their representatives. I do not think you in the United States choose your representative in the PLO. I do not think the people in Chile do that, or in Lebanon, or in Jordan, or anywhere else. We had, of course, Palestinian National Council convene here, but the way things happen is not really through a democratic process. And the worst idea I've ever heard was to speak about the possible elections in the West Bank and Gaza, but with a unified list. So some people want to have elections, but want to have the results before elections. They want to have guaranteed results before elections. I don't know how this can even be proposed, but this is the reality of what we see today. And that's where the question is. is the goal to sustain the authority of certain people in the structure, or is the goal to represent the Palestinian people and its aspiration? I believe, and I'm really sorry if we will see again people going back to the same line of negotiations and the same security coordination again. That means there is a very deep crisis that require substantial and radical change of the whole situation. And that's why I say there will be no unity, there will be no elections, and there will be no democracy if there is no readiness for accepting an alternative strategy to what has failed. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. You raise a very important point about the inseparability of internal Palestinian political dysfunction and the absence of a national strategy. And just as a reminder to our audience, we will be looking more deeply at the question of the future of a Palestinian national strategy in part 2 of this series, which will be on Thursday at this same time. Dr. Mustafa, I want to stay with you for a moment, and just if I could ask you all also to be as brief as you can, because we have about 20 minutes left. But I want to dig down on this question of succession. Obviously, the President Abbas is very advanced in his age. Are you confident in, well, first of all, could you tell us what a succession process might look like? And secondly, are you confident that a succession process or processes would unfold smoothly? And if I could ask you maybe just 2 or 3 minutes each, please.
Yeah, I won't be long. Actually, I don't think that the right question is whether there is what kind of succession will happen or take place. I do not think if there are elections for presidency that President Abbas will not run again. I think he might, and probably he will. But that's if we have elections, and I doubt that we will have elections soon. And I think the issue here is not succession, because the problem is not substituting one person with another. And it's not substituting one group with another group. I would even say it's not about substituting one party with another. It's about substituting a system with another system. As long as we don't change the system, as long as we don't have a representative system, as long as the Palestinian public and the people are not part of the decision-making process, whether we talk about political decisions or the decision about what form of struggle we should use, as long as people are not part of that, they are not part of the struggle. And that is the main reason why we are getting weaker, because the public is alienated, especially the young. 50% of Palestinian voters are now young people who never voted in their life and who feel totally alienated. And sometimes they are against everything because they don't see an opportunity to be represented, and they don't see an opportunity to say their mind. Look, now, the whole Palestinian community and the whole Palestinian political structure was talking about stopping security coordination with Israel. This was decided by the Central Council of the PLO twice, and even by the Palestinian National Council. And now it was just being renewed without consultation with anybody. I mean, that is the kind of system that needs to be changed. So the question is not succession of a person or a group, it's about changing the system in general.
Thank you. I think I'm gonna turn to some of the audience questions, which actually dovetail with some of the questions that I already had. For Noura, there's a question from, let me just find it, from Dalia Al-Masri. What do you think, it's about the, what do you think are the next steps for the collective liberation movement in the diaspora? What needs to be done strategically different now as we see more normalization, peace deals, land grabs, and so forth? And if I could add to that, what role do you see for international solidarity more broadly?
Thank you, Dalia. That's an excellent question and dovetails what the other speakers have said about one of the most significant and yet invisible losses of the establishment of the PNA has been the sidelining and the marginalization of the Palestinian diaspora very clearly, but also almost a formal separation of the rest of the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel as well. I mean, here is a population that even doesn't go mentioned. And when we talk about elections and who would represent them, we don't really grapple with, well, how are they part of the holistic whole as well, as they have been historically sidelined even since 1968. So I want to affirm that there is, and I've dealt with this as somebody who is in diaspora, right? That there's this feeling or this knee-jerk reaction that if you are not inside, then you have less legitimacy to speak for the future, and you should position yourself as an ally in solidarity and not as a member of the national body, which goes against the very nature of Palestinian national politics historically. We are a majority diaspora. To resign, right? To assign everybody in the diaspora to a solidarity position rather than a stakeholder in our national movement is to basically betray that history and to affirm these false partitions and the Bantustan situation within which we remain enclosed. So I just want to affirm that our role, frankly, is to participate in the imagining, in the new system making, in the provocation that has been raised by Dr. Barghouti and by Sam and by Tariq. We have a duty and an obligation to be part of that provocative vision about what is the future. And in fact, one of the other critiques that I've gotten from Israelis is that the Palestinian diaspora is much more, much more abstract and lofty than the Palestinians within because they're not realistic enough, right? But again, this goes to show that we have been taken advantage of, our fragmentation has been taken advantage of, our humanitarian conditions and dire conditions have been used against us to hold us hostage in order to put us in a position of capitulation rather than in a strategy. So in the bigger question, Khaled, about, and this question about that Dr. Barghouti raises about, systemic change. Let me just offer something brief in terms of how we can think about systemic change in simple, it's a big question, but we can think about it in simple ways. And the way that I think about it is, since 1993, we have shifted as a Palestinian national movie to a politics of acquiescence. We have equated self-determination with statehood, and we have performed statehood as a way of achieving the state without necessarily continuing to acknowledge what it would mean to have freedom. And so even our participation at the UN General Assembly, the bid for statehood, or the ICC bid, or the signing of 15 human rights agreements that the state of Palestine has signed, we didn't do those in order to expand, what it means to be free, but we did those in order to establish to the international community that we have the capacity as a state to do those things. It was form. It was all in form over function. And part of achieving that form has been pursuing a politics of acquiescence where we prove to the United States and to Israel that we are reliable partners, that we can police ourselves better than Israel can police us, and therefore would be able to provide security to Israel, and therefore are eligible for a state. And yet look where that brought us. And the major shift has to be to a shift of a politics of resistance. It has to be about alienating Israel. It has to be about elucidating and illuminating the US's position as a third party in this conflict and not a mediator, as the imperial patron of Israel, and exposing its contradictions. And we have ample ways of doing that. And international solidarity at the very least can do that at the very least, and has been given direction to do that since 2005 by adhering to the BDS platform of forget the political position, which Palestinians have a responsibility to articulate, at the very least, remain true to these 3 human rights demands, and do so by participating in the boycott of Israeli goods, the sanctions of weapons and military and financial aid, and divestment from Israeli goods. And so international solidarity has a clear mandate of how to do that, and the rest of the onus is on us.
Thanks, Noura. Sam, I want to turn to you, and there's a question from Deanna Greenwald on I'll just read her question here. What do you see as the main impediments to the emergence of a broad-based, inclusive, new Palestinian political movement/party, one that would not limit itself to either A, working within the existing PA structures as Fatah has done, or B, pursuing armed resistance as Hamas and others have done before? Why, and I want to add to this, why haven't we seen the emergence of a kind of, for lack of a better term, third way? Why isn't there an alternative when there's clearly a vacuum of leadership, whether we're looking at Hamas or Fatah? Why have we not seen, actually there was a party called the Third Way, and it didn't really gain much traction. Why is that? I mean, we know that the Palestinians, by and large, are educated, socially and civically mobilized. They are fragmented, of course, by geography and by the occupation. But given technology, lots of things are possible in terms of bringing people together. Why haven't we seen the kind of mass mobilization that we saw, for example, during the first Intifada in the 1980s? You're muted, Sam.
Sorry. Several points to make here. One is that we are beyond looking for a leader to save us, a savior, a second Arafat. That is a time past. We are no longer so focused on an individual that can bring a magic wand and move us forward. Similarly, we are not interested in having another party. We are, as Dr. Mustafa properly said, looking at how do we embrace the full spectrum of pluralism in our society. It may be another party, it may be 10. The issue is not the number of parties. The issue is, as again, Dr. Mustafa noted, it is a restart of our political system so the process produces political thought and political organization. We have a serious flaw. Without that, we have an entire generation, or maybe two, that does not know what a legislative process means, does not know how do you engage the international community. And I would take note a little bit with what Noura said in terms of statehood. No, I do think statehood is key. Why? Because the world is organized around states. That's not our decision. That's the way the world is organized. If it was organized around tents, I would be seeking the best and largest and best tent in the world. A state is what you make it. And I fully agree, signing on to treaties and conventions just for show isn't what the state that we want is. We need to be able to incorporate in that state a sense of democracy that really produces traction forward. Statehood by itself is not the solution. Statehood is a key pillar to a solution, but we still have other things to deal with, such as the refugee issues and other issues. However, statehood as a rallying point, in my opinion, is definitely the right way to go, only because we are part and parcel of a global world. And everything else that was spoken about, whether it's BDS or resistance, this is all a set of tools to be able to achieve political gain. Political gain needs to be defined politically. And we cannot rally around the tools if we don't have an end game.
Thanks, Sam. Tariq, I want to come back to you. I know it's been a while since we've heard from you, but can you bring all of this together for us? Like, what if you were in charge of restructuring Palestinian politics? What would you do first? And what process would you recommend pursuing? You know, is to the focus be on fixing the PA, reforming the PLO, doing the two in tandem? Representation, can it be achieved without elections? You know, the PLO historically operated on the basis of consensus of its factions. So what do you see as the way forward out of the current mess and stagnation that Palestinians are in?
That's a
big question, I know.
quite an all-encompassing question. I mean, look, there's a lot to talk about in terms of all the things that have come up here. And I think what's fascinating about this discussion is that even amongst us, there are already pluralities in terms of how we approach questions of strategy and how we approach questions of tactics and how to use what. And I think the point that I've been reflecting on throughout this discussion is that whatever change is going to happen, and this in the back of my mind, I'm thinking about the PA's decision to go back to security coordination and Noura's point about the politics of acquiescence. Whatever change is going to happen, the change is going to be fundamentally disruptive, because everything that has been happening on the ground today is one where the parties themselves, including the Palestinians in the factions as they exist, are interested in sustaining the illusion of a status quo. There's no status quo. Things are evolving, annexation is deepening, colonization is continuing. But there's this investment in maintaining the reality as it exists today, this sense of a status quo, and the illusion that we're moving towards peace. Whatever emerges next has to be something that fundamentally disrupts this entire system. So by default, it's going to be one that pushes back. I mean, the politics of resistance is one way of describing it, that pushes back against an acquiescence or an acceptance to the reality that's unfolding on the ground. Now, in that sense, when I look at the factions themselves are no longer agents of resistance. The factions today are factions that employ people, that pay people's wages, that people may be referred to as identity measures. You know, you're either a Hamsawi or a Fathawi. That's devoid of a larger liberation project. They are just institutions that have taken hold of people socially. So I think when I started this conversation by saying I'm optimistic. And the reason why I think I'm optimistic is because by default, we've got into a position that we can't build on anymore. And we are in a moment of transition, whether our leaders are acknowledging it or not, we are transitioning into something new. And the grassroots mobilization that the Palestinians have today is spectacular. I mean, it's incredible that compared to other occupied and indigenous and colonized people, we are able to have this kind of voice on the international arena. So I think that that is something that gives me hope. So when I'm trying to answer your question, Khalid, for me, it's really about building on that grassroots. I think that there is strength in where we are as a people today. We're a young people, and our constituencies are all over the world. We're global. And we have very active mobilization, whether it's the Great March of Return in Gaza or what's happening in 48 or in the West Bank. There are signs that there is still mobilization happening. So the way forward for me is how to harness that power into political action and to accept that that political action is going to be disruptive. It is going to be dealt with punitively by the U.S. administrations, whatever it is, whether it's Democratic or Republican. It's going to be dealt with punitively by the Israelis. It's not only Hamas that's sanctioned. We get, if the PA goes into the ICC or goes into BDS, those are criminalized. So there needs to be an acceptance that we need to resuscitate a project of resistance. And by resistance, this is a holistic umbrella. It's not only armed resistance. A project of resistance that's fundamentally based on values that are very clear, that have informed the political consciousness of our people since before 48, which are justice, freedom, and equality. And I think resuscitating a political project around those that is by essence pluralistic, in the sense that there will be the Sams talking about statehoods and the Noura talking about not statehoods and everywhere in between, that by default needs to exist under a single umbrella of liberation. What that umbrella is, defining that umbrella, what is liberation today for the Palestinian people, that's the next step that we need to embark on.
Thanks, Tariq. I know I'm cognizant of our time, but I do want to give each of you 30 seconds to a minute to respond to anything that has been said or make some closing statement. And we're going to steal that. I know we started a few minutes late, so we're going to steal that time from the future arbitrarily. Noura, I think you wanted to weigh in.
I'm going to take the whole minute, Khaled. I just want just a point of provocation to leave with the audience in terms of Sam's remark that we are organized as a series of states and not tents. The statehood movement is a 20th century, it's a modern phenomenon of organizing ourselves as states. It is not the only way of organizing ourselves, and it is only about a total of 200 years old, even considering prior to the Third World Revolt, where colonized peoples became states. That's one. Number two, Palestinians have had 3 opportunities to become states in the interwar years, in the Third World Revolt, and in the 1990s. We have not met those opportunities as other states have, other colonized people, and have an onus upon us to achieve this new vision. Number 3 is to say that that is the same message that Frantz Fanon and other revolutionary leaders left for us as they told us not to emulate Europe. And even in our revolutionary moment, we never imagined the state as the end. We imagined the state as the predicate element in a broader struggle against imperialism, which sheds light on the fact that most post-colonial nations that are now independent are not the panacea, are not the future for us, not Namibia, not South Africa, not Algeria, not Egypt. I mean, there is something beyond that we have the opportunity to think about. And I agree with you that, the BDS and other civil society movements are not the solution. They're only tactics, but we need vision. And that vision is necessary whether or not we use those tactics. And that's precisely the onus. What is our political vision? What is the future? And one of the things I've been asking audiences is to think about the return of Palestinian refugees, not as the culmination of our freedom struggle, but as the beginning of it. Once Palestinian refugees have returned, what now does the political entity look like? Think about it from there forward in order to build this vision that we can fight for.
Thanks, Noura. Sam, Dr. Mustafa, and Tara, I want to give you each a minute also. And if someone wants to respond, I'll put this question out there if it's compelling. What would you advise the incoming Biden administration to do or not do to allow Palestinians to have their sort of breathing space to conduct and sort of fix their internal political house? Sam, you want to?
Yeah, I want to take 30 seconds. What I would end with is the following. We are normal people. We have internal politics. Luckily for the global community, US included, our internal politics is our problem. And the best they can do is to stay out of it and look at the situation as an occupier and an occupied. And under international law, if we still respect international law, then the occupier must be held accountable. And third states, US included, are not observers to a sport match. They have an obligation under international law to hold the parties accountable. So yes, we spent an hour talking about internal politics. It's good to know about it, but it should not be a barrier to taking action.
We can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Dr. Mustafa, would you like to make a closing statement?
Sure. I have 2 ideas. First of all, regarding the vision, I've just published a book which is exposes the deal of the century, not as Trump's plan, but as the Zionist movement plan. And that book includes a proposed strategy, proposed ideas for a strategy. But there is a main idea here. When we speak about justice, freedom, and equality, I think we have to include not only the issue of self-determination and the issue of the right of refugees for return, but I think a major goal should be to bring down the system of apartheid in the whole of Palestine, not just in the West Bank and Gaza. The system of apartheid is affecting Palestinians in the occupied territories in 1948 areas, and in the diaspora. This is the chain or the link that could reunify Palestinian struggle against injustice, against racism, against the system of apartheid, which in my opinion has become a much worse apartheid than what prevailed in South Africa. Some people feel worried when we speak about apartheid as if this negates the issue of national rights, which is not true. Nobody speaks about civil equality only. One should speak also about national equality. But I think we need a whole new vision. Unfortunately, we're going to face now another round of useless stuff like negotiations. And that's why when you ask me what I do want to propose to Biden, I cannot propose anything he will do. The most important thing is to force Israel to stop settlement activities, which he will not do. Obama could not do that. But I think when we speak about the American scene, I totally propose that we should work with the progressive camp in the United States, with those who are natural allies of Palestinians who struggle against injustice and against racism and against imperialism, if you want. We should not rely on these regimes that are never going to be supporting our struggle.
Thank you. Tariq, the last word will be yours.
Thanks, Khaled. I agree with what's been said, and I think the only thing to add is to sort of add how I think about my role and the role of people who are committed to Palestinian rights in the coming period, is to, even though there might be changes that are happening on the global stage, and even though there will be incessant attacks either from Israel or the US in terms of sustaining the system of colonization on the land, there needs to be a time for us to step back, to strategize, and to think about what our longer term goal looks like. So as we're standing firm, trying to defend against those attacks, we need to maintain a strategic vision to try to think about all the questions that came up today, all the questions that Dr. Barghouti just raised in terms of what an anti-apartheid struggle could look like. We need to strategize around that and try to keep the long view in mind.
Thank you, Tariq. And as a reminder, we will be diving more deeply into this question of a Palestinian national strategy in part 2 on Thursday. So I encourage everyone to join us for that. And with that, I'm afraid we've already we've overstepped our time. I want to thank our panelists, Sam Bahour, Noura Arakat, Tariq Bakouni, Mustafa Barghouti. Thank you very much for an extremely rich discussion. I know we've only scratched the surface, but I hope this will be the first of many such discussions. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.